So again, good evening, everyone. My name is Mikhail Solomon. I'm the director of Prizm Art Fair, and I'm happy to be in dialogue with two of my favorite people. One being Adam Ganuza of the Knight Foundation and Tayyib Smith from Little Giant. Adam Ganuza joined the Knight Foundation in August of 2016. He has held various positions in healthcare administration and policy analysis, engineering research, and in film, television, live music, and festival production. Prior to Knight, Ganuza was production director of the Rhythm Foundation in Miami, a Miami Beach-based arts and culture nonprofit that fosters international cultural exchange through music. He is a graduate of the National Urban Fellows Program, an academic and leadership development program that focuses on increasing diversity in the public and nonprofit sectors. Ganuza is a Miami native, and he earned his Bachelor of Science from Brown University, a Master of Science from the University of Michigan, and a Master of Public Administration from Baruch College. Tayyib is the co-founder of principal of Meta Global, parent company of Little Giant Creative, and the Institute of Hip Hop Entrepreneurship, which is a Knight Foundation grantee. The Institute of Hip Hop Entrepreneurship is dedicated to cultural competency and the ability to engage multicultural audiences. He co-founded Pipeline Philly to serve as an inviting and dynamic co-working space filled with professionals from various backgrounds and industries, creating one of the most diverse workspaces in the city. He's also a partner of S&R Holdings, a real estate company that engages and invites diverse stakeholders of neighborhoods to become part of a growing multicultural and multi-socioeconomic tapestry. So, to begin, I think the real reason why I thought these gentlemen would be such a great part of Prizm and the Prizm experience is that Knight has played such an incredible role in building the arts ecosystem here in Miami. The Knight Foundation is, of course, a partner and a sponsor of Prizm Art Fair, and has simultaneously supported some of the programming that Tayyib has been doing in Philadelphia, particularly around a recent project called Redlining, a Dream Deferred, which he'll talk about through a number of slides today. It's a really incredible project that really talks about some of the issues that are deeply affecting our urban policy landscape here in the United States, and quite frankly have been a long-term problem policy-wise for a while. Intergenerational problem. So I'll let Tayyib and Adam sort of talk about what they do independently and together.
So I just wanted to mention that you and I actually met in San Francisco when Carol Coletta at Knight sent me to the Prototype Festival, and we met on the street and kind of bonded immediately. And one day you were visiting me in Philadelphia, and we were walking down the street.
Yeah, and I met you guys. You were randomly on the street.
You introduced me to Adam before he was at Knight Foundation, when he was doing his city fellowship, and you were like, yo, you two should know each other. Yeah. I think that speaks to something that's continually happened in my life, that whether you look at arts movements, whether you look at entrepreneurs, there's usually a cluster of individuals that actually create the nucleus of a scene. And I just think it's funny that now you're a colleague who works with an institution that's funded some of my things, but I didn't. Yeah. You had a little more. A little more credibility because you came through my sister, Mikhail.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Mikhail, for having me here today. It's actually a real great pleasure to be in such a beautiful building, surrounded by beautiful objects of art, and here to talk about a subject that I hold dearly, that you hold dearly, and I think that a lot of people in this audience also keep dearly to themselves, which is about social practice in art, or social praxis in art, to be more specific. So what we're going to be discussing here tonight is, I got to be honest with you, and this is at the risk of embarrassing myself a little bit. When you told me that this was about art and social praxis, I thought it was like a typo, and I was like, I've never even heard this word before.
Really?
Yes, and I do crosswords and stuff, which is like pretty interesting. And so I looked it up, and what it is it is essentially like practice, but without the theory. Focus strictly on the what is being done and the activities that are being done. So I think that's what we're going to focus on this evening. We're going to talk about social practice in that sense of what are some ways that Tayyib's group are thinking about their social practice through art, and then we'll draw in some examples from other projects and programs that Knight has funded and stuff that I just think is really interesting.
Okay. So to back up a little bit, in my life, I'm an entrepreneur. I've had a very varied career. I've helped market everything from cars to alcohol to movies to films. And probably about 5, maybe 8 years ago, I started to get frustrated, and that the things that I was marketing, I realized that I was contributing to landfill. And I attended a retreat, actually, with a group called the Opportunity Agenda.
Okay.
And in that, it was like a 5-day retreat with about 70 people, all like way above my praxis, pay grade, everything. And I couldn't understand for the first day why I was there until they started talking about speaking to youth, marketing, social political agendas.
Sure.
And then I was like, oh, y'all don't know what you're talking about. You know, because as someone who's came from the music industry and has been marketing youth for some time, I realized that a lot of foundations, institutions, NGOs weren't connected to culture. And that's when my partner Megan and I started talking about how to switch the maybe direction or ethos of our company to start using what we know through branding for social justice initiatives. So I should back up and say that this is one of 2 Knight Cities challenges that we won. So Knight Foundation did a 3-year challenge, committing $5 million a year over 3 years, looking for the best ideas that would have a positive impact on community, using your personal skill sets. And the Dream Deferred is the second of 2 Knight Foundation awards we won. Was not an easy process. 26 cities, 4,500 applicants a year. We made the finals of 140 people every year. And then our first project was the Institute of Hip Hop Entrepreneurship. Our second project was a Dream Deferred. And a Dream Deferred is basically using technology, panel discussions, research, and an interdisciplinary exhibit around the history of housing policy in the United States, which is something that's very near and dear to me. Entrepreneurship allowed me and my family to basically jump a couple pay grades or tax levels. And throughout my life, what people describe as gentrification is so much more complex than the capital G word. So we took this initiative to kind of have a positive impact on raising the dialogue around the history of housing policy in the United States. And we had a considerable amount of success thanks to Knight.
Sure. And so, as I understand it, the project itself focused on a handful of neighborhoods in Philadelphia and looked at the history of these neighborhoods from like the 1920s, somewhere around there, up to today, in this really multi-layered kind of way. Maybe you could describe a couple of those layers?
So we did a GIS mapping and kind of unpacked the public policy as how it would affect 4 different families. So through a touch screen technology, you could do 4 different routes through Philadelphia. And if any of you are familiar with the different sections of Philadelphia, we did Center City, we did Fishtown, which are the river wards, we did West Philadelphia, and then we began to show the history of each one of those neighborhoods and how you as a particular individual would go through the housing policy. And that is complex in the sense that redlining is something that some people know about, but I don't think enough people really understand how that it speaks to 21st century public policy. So redlining was a way that you could decode who could have access to capital. And black families were always at the last. And black communities were actually delineated as red. Latino communities were as well. One thing I always feel necessary to mention when describing that is that there are maps in Washington, D.C. that basically described what were or what are our quote-unquote underdeveloped ghettos and black communities.
Yeah, those maps are actually really interesting because now if you look at them in terms of the demographics of today, you sort of lose some of the effect. But if you look at them with the demographics of the time when they were created, it's very clear that it was like, this line is around like the black neighborhood, this line is around, the Jewish neighborhood, this line is around the Italian neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One
of the things of what you just said triggered a memory. So in looking at this in Philadelphia and then around the country, one thing that always comes up is that blacks always lived where the Jews formerly lived. So West Philadelphia used to be a Jewish community, and now it's a black community. There are same things exist in Brooklyn, in Detroit, Miami, and redlining, I have to say, from doing research, is just one element in the tool belt of intergenerational warfare against poor people, in the sense that if you were coming back from World War II and you're an African-American soldier, your GI Bill didn't work the same as somebody who was Irish or Italian or Jewish. When they decided what highways were going to go through communities, intentionally highways deconstructed the most vibrant black corridors.
Overtown is a perfect example of that.
Overtown,
right here, yeah.
Pittsburgh, Detroit. I mean, Overtown is probably, just seeing Overtown over the last 20 years, if you have a historical construct and see how the highways kind of cut right through the spaces, that is what I describe as generational warfare.
Right. And so you have this huge topic that has so many different layers to it, complexities to it. This exhibit itself also has a lot of layers and complexities to it, not only through the sort of technology and the storytelling. It has a sort of multi-layered experience that somebody who would go to the exhibit would go through. Why did you and the other creators of the exhibit feel it so important to have that kind of multi-layered structure to the experience of the viewer?
So I have experienced and found that people on both sides of the economic divide in the United States have a broken language about public policy. So people who grew up in the suburbs still have this Reagan-era idea about people who didn't contribute to their communities, or concepts of welfare moms and inner city crime, which is actually like a late 20th century form of dog whistling, for political means. But then when you talk to people who have grown up in those environments, they're armed with the same vocabulary. So I've had debates with people who frankly live on the borders of poverty, and if you talk to them about public policy, they blame their neighbors, or they say it's because my neighbor doesn't clean up, or it's because my neighbor's badass little kids are out in front of the corner store. but they don't understand the intergenerational public policy that doesn't allow people to basically build wealth within their homes. Yeah. In the United States, the average Black and Latino family has somewhere in the range of $1,500 to $4,500 in accessible capital. So we all know what that would mean if you have a car accident, if you have a medical emergency, if you have a gap in employment. The average white family has between $116,000 and $140,000. There is a myth of meritocracy. Do people believe that has to do with hard work? Yeah. But Black and brown people have been working hard since before this was a nation. Yeah. And we have not been able to participate in the 20th century economy and are not capitalized properly to participate in the 21st century economy. So ultimately, everything about A Dream Deferred was about raising the dialogue around public policy so you could create spaces of empathy so people can actually communicate and then in some way engage with the political system.
Sure. And it's a great segue. So this is going to sound like a non sequitur and everybody's going to take a little walk around the block, but there's a point to this story, okay? So the other day I was watching television and I saw a commercial for the Shriners Children's Hospital. And in this commercial, they have some of the young patients come out and they're telling them how great their experience is with the Shriners Hospital and how your support can be so important to the hospital. And they're all smiling and happy, and it's a really like kind of jovial story that's being told. And and I was reminded of the old Susan Sarandon, like, give this kid $5 a month version of those commercials, which were the exact opposite. They were like these really just terrible images, exactly like
the 80s bloated
it was
African stomach.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Where it's meant to evoke indignation and like shame on the viewer. And it turned out that you don't see those commercials anymore because they've done studies on this, and it shows that the positively framed versions are more effective in generating empathy and getting people to donate money. I was going through now here's the question. I was going through the website a little bit, and the stories that you're trying to tell are really hard stories, right? They're heartbreaking, they're about intergenerational warfare, and they're about generally really bad situations that are being imposed upon other people. How do you, from a perspective of the storyteller, sort of ride that balance between talking about this sort of kind of injustice that's been done on these communities, and like, how do you ride that balance between this kind of negative framing and this positive and sort of a positive framing to generate that sort of empathy that you're trying to get out of it?
So I'm a pretty dystopian dude. I don't have the privilege of believing a lot of propagandized poppycock about American history. Sure. So like, I have to live in uncomfortable spaces constantly. Yeah. I would say that's the intergenerational Black burden, is looking at the reality of your existence and still having the ability to have empathy, forgiveness, patience, and sometimes in dealing with well-intentioned aspects of philanthropy or people who perceive themselves to be progressive. It's an incredible weight and burden to understand your history, to understand how much your own history has been propagandized, and still speak truth to power. So I would say I don't necessarily have the privilege to believe in like a very lionized, apple pie, work hard, meritocratic America. I have to deal with the reality that has been bestowed on me, and I have to, myself, my partner, believe that we have to have a commitment to telling that truth, whether it's uncomfortable or not, and expect or desire change that might not happen in my lifetime. And if I think about what enabled me to have the agency and the ability that I do in the 21st century, it's definitely to women and men who did this work long before me, who were not able to benefit from the things that I'm reaping rewards from today.
I mean, there's no way around a certain level of discomfort when you're talking about the history of housing policy in the United States, right? Because we go to any major American city, take a walk around, and you can see firsthand what the effects of, a policy that was put in place, I don't know, 80 years ago and lasted until 70 years ago, something like that.
So to speak to that for a second, I think what really makes me uncomfortable is whether, if I look at, you could go to Williamsburg, the corner of 6th and Wythe in Brooklyn, over the last 10 years, right? And then you could go to Frankfurt and Girard in Philadelphia. Or you could go to Woodward Avenue in Detroit. Or some people might not know that Wynwood was formerly a Puerto Rican community. Or what I was saying to some of you earlier about what's happened now to Little Haiti after the design district became what it is today. So to continually have that experience, for me to be in Detroit last week, which conservatively is a city that's 81% Black and 7% Latino, and be out 2-3 nights a week and be the only African American man in a space that's paying, not bussing tables, not doing security, not standing outside panhandling, to travel the United States, to have the level of development and the zeitgeist changing to where urban cores are now aspirational versus suburbia, it's something that I would have to do a deep dive and try to affect, not just public policy, but conversations around this history. Because if not, it feels like a slow cultural erasure to be in formerly Black spaces that are unwelcoming.
And I think therein lies the strength of art and culture as a means for social change, because central to the kind of fighting back against this cultural erasure that you're talking about is the idea of the opposite of it, which will be cultural preservation. And in my estimation, that comes generally speaking in the form of storytelling. And projects like Dream Deferred, which use these really sort of multi-layered explorations of history, and there's some also kind of artwork that is created, I don't know, interpretive artwork that sort of spawned from that. I don't know how you would want to describe it, but sure. This is the way that art can be used as a social practice, because stories have a way of reaching a listener on an emotional level, on a way where people can see themselves reflected in the characters that you're laying out in the story, and it's not like a lecture or just a straight PowerPoint and some graphs. So I'm sure that if you got your exhibit and it was just a series of maps and data points, like, nobody's coming, bro.
People wouldn't unpack it. So one of the things, to describe the exhibit a little bit more, so similar to this, the exhibit is in an old bank. Banks are really interesting because you're never going to be able to use this level of materials, granite, marble, wood, without capitalism, imperialism, and to some extent, chattel slavery. So like buildings like this, to your point earlier, stopped being built in the 1930s. It was like the end of the road for that depth and breadth of capitalism. So we were able to secure an old Frank Farnese, very famous architect from Philadelphia, bank at 6th and Spring Garden. And I think there was something about not being in a traditional institutional museum space that allowed us to have a deeper dive conversation and also get people from communities that don't necessarily feel welcome in institutional spaces. And that created I'd say the groundwork for a different type of conversation. I think oftentimes, even with the best intentions, institutions, particularly hierarchical white-led institutions, with the best intentions, dilute the message of something. Having the autonomy to be in a space that is independent allowed us to do some creative things that might be seen as too progressive or revolutionary for an institution with a lot of different types of eyes.
Sure, and it kind of primes your mind into thinking like, I'm going to see something different. Which, by the way, I'd encourage everybody to take a look at all the really incredible details that are in this room and in this building, particularly on the ceiling, which is the original paintings from like 1930, 1929, something like that, and it lays out the history of Florida, air quotes, and then some of local flora and fauna. And it's really interesting to see the contrast of the sort of conquistador saying hello to the Indian up there, and the art that's being presented here on the at the floor level. I don't think that's planned, but it just works out. It works out really well.
Right. It was a serendipitous mistake in that when we did the tour of the space and I looked up at the ceiling, I was like, oh, that's problematic. We'll just resolve it through the artwork that we show at the art fair. So you're spot on with that. I think the work in the fair, of course, is progressive in nature and is the counterpoint for what is illustrated on the ceiling.
Yeah, and I think that's also a really great framing for this idea of narratives and kind of contrasting narratives and creating through the means of art a different narrative to combat the one that people have been sort of programmed to believe. So, people think, my neighborhood has problems because my neighbor and the dog, relieves itself on the street or whatever. That might not necessarily be the case, but the way that narrative is countered is with another one to replace it. How I see it.
George Orwell has a collection of essays that are named "All Art is Propaganda." I find that to be really inspirational because even if you look at your most basic fruit bowl art, do you know what I mean? Like you go to your average suburban art fair.
Motel 6.
You're going to get a bowl of apples or something. That in and of itself is propaganda because it's hiding a reality within our homes, whether are things that we don't want to speak to. Yeah. So for me, even there's something that should be always clandestine about the message of art, and I'm always turned on by artists who are trying to push a message or to dive deeper into your psyche.
Sure.
In a progressive, clandestine way.
Back in your marketer days, you might have used that power in a different way.
Definitely.
That's the whole skill. That's the art of it, man.
Without question. Without question.
So, all this talk about narratives and sort of fighting fire with fire in that sense begs the question, okay, so what happens next? So when somebody comes to your exhibit, well, not that slide, but you know what I'm talking about, what are you hoping for that person to leave with? What are they supposed to do with all that information?
Great question. So hopefully they will be armed with a different perspective on history and be engaged to be involved in their communities from a different perspective. So if we all believe that our urban cores evolved into what they're known for from a negative perspective, through people just not being engaged, or people not sweeping up, or people not taking care of their badass kids, like, that's fake.
Yeah.
Like, that's completely, that's not a reality. If people have a better understanding that, like, oh, you know, my neighbor, my relative, people of my lineage weren't armed with the right tools to navigate through education, healthcare, public policy, it will hopefully, this might be naive on my part, but hopefully it would encourage them to engage in their social political environment from a more empathetic space. So most of the work that we do at the core, the goal, is creating a space where people have a shared nomenclature, a shared understanding of a history, so that they can actually communicate. Because a lot of times if you don't have that shared perspective or ground to your architecture, you're only going to talk at people, and you're not going to have a shared perspective to even imagine solutions of the future.
Yeah, I mean, in a situation like that, the possibility for compromise or a solution is like none, because you're not even agreeing on the base facts from which you're arguing or debating.
We had in complement to this, we did a series of, I guess you could call them panel discussions, but they were more like town halls. Some in untraditional spaces like this, others at WHYY, which is essentially NPR in Philadelphia. And my favorite of that panel discussion was called, quote unquote, Freedom Makes Negroes Crazy. I saw your face. That's actually a quote from the Vice President of the United States in the late 1800s, John C. Calhoun, and he used that as an argument against abolition, because he said that Negroes who escaped, or Negroes who had any access to freedom, would actually go crazy, and it would encourage them to make more requests. And actually, in the late 1800s, they used to deport African Americans who could read in Charleston, South Carolina, and that's how Liberia was created, because they thought that people who had any understanding of history or their intellect would spread like a disease among other African Americans.
Yeah, I mean, this is totally off topic, but it's par for the course for North America, and particularly the Caribbean. You know, after the Haitian Revolution in 1803, something like that, late 1800s, that country was essentially blackballed from dealing with any other of the other neighboring islands, because they didn't want the slaves on Cuba, in the rest of the Dominican Republic, and in Jamaica to get any funny ideas.
And to complement your point, although descendants of slavery never received any reparations, the nation of Haiti actually paid reparations to the government of France.
To the French until like 1950 or something like that.
Yeah, and which kind of speaks to the poverty of the Caribbean. But when you unpack that and you think about that in 21st century terms, it's almost like something you can't come back from.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. Do you have any questions?
I don't, but
yeah, can we go to the audience? From the audience, any questions?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for this very interesting conversation. I am wondering two things. The second question is probably the easier one. I'll start with the first one, though, which is I'm wondering right now, I think a lot of people, certainly myself, feel like we're in a place where people are feeling more polarized, not only politically but socially, and so there's a lot of, and I'm including myself, unfortunately, difficulty being willing to listen to people who feel differently. Luckily, there are a lot of folks, leaders, who are, I think, starting to try to address this and work together. I'm wondering if in this work, you're experiencing some of that, where there's some challenges to people kind of being willing to listen to the history that you're presenting. I mean, I would imagine in some of the settings, you're getting a self-selected group of people who are interested and are willing, but are you also working in some settings where you're having some challenges with that?
So the last 2 years, in talking about this project in particular, there's only been one instance where I was really challenged and pushed back, and I was speaking to a group of students at Westchester University, and I would say probably about 1/3 of the room were white identified young men who looked like they wanted to kill me. And and I actually empathize with them because I can remember being a hard-headed youth where I didn't want to hear from older people. But I have to say, frankly, we have had the opposite of that. I've had colleagues who work in real estate, who are real estate developers. I've had colleagues who are the staffs of city council members and state representatives coming to us humbly and saying, I had no idea. I thought I knew, but until you unpacked it in this capacity, I didn't know. And frankly, I expected more pushback, but people have not given us that energy. Most people who've come to the exhibit, and if it was outside of their realm of thinking, they might have brought another person and be like, now they're the teacher. So that's been a really positive thing that's come from.
Thank you. That is very encouraging. and actually what you just said leads to my second question, which is, can we, certainly there's a website, but the presentation that's been going on the screen while you've been talking, can we access that particular slide presentation?
Absolutely.
Cool.
Absolutely.
To send it on to other people.
Yeah. I just showed some of the same group of slides to Knight Foundation in Detroit. Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions? And well, I think to your question, total stranger who I don't know in the audience, I think again, I'm going to go back to the importance of storytelling, and using a narrative using storytelling to help to get a point across. It is easier to have it's harder for somebody to shut out a story than it is for them to shut out a lecture or a scolding with a wagging finger. I got it.
So this was a public policy choice that had effects. Do you see the solution being a public policy solution, and what types of things are you interested in?
Great question. So some of you might have heard of Rashida Tlaib. She is the new congresswoman from Detroit, one of two of the first Muslim Americans to ever be in Congress. She has a public policy called the New Civil Rights Act, and she actually wants to pay restorative history to policies of redlining. So for some time now, I guess about 3 or 4 years, my partner Megan Denenberg and I have been using the language around a New Deal. I think the young woman from Brooklyn who's a congresswoman, her name escapes me. The lady from Queens. Yes. Yes, Ocasio-Cortez. She frames hers around a new Green Deal. For me, I think the only way that we can combat the reality of the growing inequality in the United States is around some type of public policy that is going to give people access to safe, equitable, walkable neighborhoods where you have access to food, healthcare, and education. I don't know of any other thing that is going to put the nation on track to a course of equity. And if you talk to the average, let's say, gentleman above 60, there was a young woman who asked a question earlier in the previous panel about why young people weren't buying art, like people 60 to 80. I wanted to like jump up and down and say that's because all of the wealth that exists in the Black community exists with baby boomers and those who were just able to grab hold of or get access to 20th century New Deal policies. So unless we create a new pathway for people to have access to the same types of subsidized education, subsidized healthcare, subsidized ability to create businesses, that frankly people identify as white in the 21st century, even though their grandparents didn't. Right? You know, like if you're Slavic, if you're Italian, if you're Irish, you know, if you're Polish, your great-great-grandparents probably didn't identify as white. If we don't give Black and Latino and, you know, new immigrant communities that same level of basic quality of life policies to create wealth, I think that we will stay on course to be a nation of inequality.
Well, thank you everyone again for sitting with us to listen to Adam Ganuza and Tayyib Smith. That concludes our panel series for Prizm 2018. So if you haven't yet seen the exhibition and the galleries, please take some time to do that. So have a good night.